good to give a round of applause. Yes, and thank you. I will now introduce Belinda Duckworth, and she will be presenting on Rethinking High Density Living, Australia's first family design service. Welcome, Belinda.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Belinda Duckworth, and I work in the Centre for Population Health at Western Sydney Local Health District, and it's an honour to be here this morning. I'm going to be talking about rethinking healthy high-density living and sharing social marketing insights and outcomes into the development of Australia's first advocacy, planning and design guide for families living in high density. It's quite ironic, I'm married to an architect, but I've spent my whole life listening to designs, but here I am, a public health practitioner, social marketer, I think definitely colouring outside the lines and really enjoying this delicious ambiguity that Maria was talking about. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on this morning, the Nguamal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people joining me this morning. The presentation will cover the social marketing journey to date, identifying the problem, the results of the formative research, through to the development and the launch of the guide, and its impact both upstream in terms of policy development, but also downstream behaviours such as the design behaviours of tomorrow's architects. And I'll close with some important learnings so far. Oh, the housing issue, isn't it topical? And here we are in Canberra, what a perfect place to be speaking about it. Housing affordability and supply are critical political issues with ambitious federal and state government housing targets set. With more families with children living in apartments, high-density housing and design often overlook their needs, and navigating housing reform agendas to influence health outcomes remains a really complex challenge. We know that a child's early years, so that 0 to 5 period, are a critical time for their physical, cognitive, emotional, social health. And we link this to New South Wales Health's First 2,000 Days framework, with advocacy for greater consideration within the framework of the child's environment, so the home and the neighbourhood. In the city of Parramatta, where this project originated from, the percentage of families with children under 4 years living in high-density housing is 45%, and this is increasing. But as long as density is done well and has many potential benefits in delivering compact, walkable and sustainable cities, but there's no currently best practice guidelines on family-friendly high-density living, which signals a major gap within the planning policy. We've been researching this issue since 2017 with our partners with City of Parramatta Council, who we have a formal partnership with, specifically investigating the impact of higher density living with a specific focus on families with young children. Outcomes of this partnership work have included a literature review, a survey of residents through Council's Have Your Say portal, and qualitative research which asks parents about the perceived health benefits on their children aged 0 to 5 living in higher density housing in the city of Parramatta. These pieces of work provided really valuable insights and contributed to the development of the guide, as well as added to the local evidence base. The key findings were that there's no simple categorisation of high-density housing as either good or bad. The impact of high-density housing on child health is context-dependent, and the particular child, their social environment, the dwelling, the building and the surrounding neighbourhood are all layers within an ecological system of influence. So not all high-density housing is created equal, and from an equity-focused approach to child's health, it's useful to recognise that children living in high density are not homogenous. So therefore, it is important to design environments that consider and apply all known protective factors, enabling a child to thrive and to flourish. Now, as social marketers, I know that you're particularly interested in formative research and the qualitative research, so I wanted to share some of the insights of what families told us about their experience of living in high density. You can see some of the quotes on the slide there. But some top-line findings of this qual research was that most families intended to move house within 1 to 6 years. In comparison to families who intended to stay in an apartment, they provided reasons such as finances, amenity, access to transport and employment were favourable, and they themselves were familiar with growing up in an apartment. Many reported perceived negative effects on their child's health with things such as lack of ventilation and noise sources. Desirable features of the apartment and building design included living on the ground floor, in smaller buildings and in apartments with larger bedrooms and open plan living, and no surprise that storage was a critical issue that families told us. And furthermore, parents valued social connection and interaction, and many reported challenges in creating social connections in their local neighbourhood. So all of these research sort of provided really valuable input, and we developed a draft guide. Because there was a gap in the planning policy, we formed a working group. There was myself and 2 colleagues from the Centre for Population Health, 2 colleagues from the City of Parramatta, and an architect called Natalia Krysiak from Cities for Play. And she'd been on a Churchill Fellowship and had researched best practice family-friendly apartments all over the world. So in terms of, from a social marketing perspective, the intervention, so the development of the draft guide, aimed to change how higher density housing, and when we say higher density, we mean 3 stories or more, how it is addressed in the City of Parramatta planning policy and in design, and we wanted them to adopt key principles from the guide within 24 months of launch. The secondary aim is to achieve changes in design, planning and policy behaviours in at least one other Western Sydney council within 2 years of launch to embed the guide's principles. And I am delighted to share with you that we have kicked big goals because we have gone way beyond Western Sydney in some of the policy changes and some of the behaviours that we've seen, and I'll share that soon. We use the social ecological model to inform our intervention, and this model broadens social marketing thinking beyond individualistic parameters and seeks collaboration among stakeholders. So in our case, it was urban planners, designers, architects, NGOs, policymakers. I can't tell you that I'm now on first name basis with the government architect, and when we won an award 2 weeks ago, I was like, oh, he came to give me a shake. He said, no, give me a hug. I mean, who would have thought that a public health professional would be collaborating with the government architects? But this particular sociological model acknowledges that behaviours both shape and are shaped by the social environment. So about the guide, I won't go into a lot of detail. I am going to play you a video because I know you're perhaps wanting to know how we developed the guide, but the aim of it does aim to address this gap within the planning policy and showcase best practice examples of how to enhance livable outcomes. The guide offers timely, actionable solutions at the building and also the neighbourhood scales to influence policy and to support families with children. It's broken into 2 parts. Part 1 is the building scale and Part 2 the neighbourhood scale. The content of the draft guide, as I mentioned, was informed by all that formative evidence that we had been conducting since 2017. So just briefly, Part 1, the document's about 70 pages long. You can download it. I'll share a QR code at the end of the presentation. But Part 1 looks at things like building configuration, the apartment layout, playable outdoor space, community rooms and social lobbies. And it also includes diagrams like the one you can see and also examples from all over the world to showcase, to give designers and planners ideas of how this aspirational document can be, how the principles can be embedded into their work. Part 2 is the neighbourhood scale, and that focuses on the surrounding environment, so child-friendly travel routes, how do children get to school, looking at diverse play opportunities beyond just a token park with some swings. What is the infrastructure like for caregivers who play a critical role in looking after and caring for young children? And the guide goes into detail with examples through each of those policies and recommendations. In terms of audience segmentation, we did a very thorough analysis of our stakeholders, and we mapped them out from local council, urban planners and designers, public health policy, key government agencies such as Transport for New South Wales, Department of Planning, Infrastructure and Environment, which does include the Open Spaces team and the government architect, NGOs who are strong advocates in this field, such as the Heart Foundation, academics who research and build evidence in this space, and industry stakeholders such as the Urban Design Association and the Committee for Sydney, which is a leading advocacy organisation in this space. We adopted a multi-channel approach to assess the value and insights from these key stakeholders in relation to our draft guide. And our objective was really to understand, would key stakeholders, do they find it of value, and are we engaging them appropriately? And also, was there anything missing from the draft guide? How could we strengthen it? As I mentioned, we mapped out the stakeholders according to the stakeholder influencer model, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, based on their level of influence and their level of interest. And you can see that most of our stakeholders hovered between collaborate and empower quadrant and consult quadrant. For example, we engage researchers who specialise on this topic because they have a high interest, and these researchers have become advocates. For example, Dr. Sophie May Kerr, who works at UNSW, she spoke at the recent New South Wales parliamentary inquiry into transport-oriented design, and she said, "Can I reference your guide in my evidence?" It was tabled in Parliament, and it obviously gave greater exposure to the guide. You can see that we've got state government agencies as a key stakeholder, but even within that segment, there were some that were far more influential, such as the government architect within the Department of Planning and Infrastructure portfolio. So how did we liaise and how did we engage our stakeholders to find out what they thought of the draft guide? Well, various ways according to how important they were and how the level of influence and interest they had within around this topic. There were, we had some one-on-one interviews with some high-value stakeholders. We held 9 online workshops, such as we presented to the Urban Design Association, which was over 100 urban designers and planners from across Australia. Many council workshops where there were 19 councils represented from their design and policy teams. We also created an online survey. We had 43 responses to that, and we received several submissions, written submissions, for example, from the General Manager of one of the councils in Western Sydney. So we engaged with over 300 stakeholders and received nearly 500 comments about the draft guide. Stakeholders consistently told us that the guide would be of value to their work, they would use it, but also of those 500 comments, a third were related to what was missing and how we could strengthen it. And so, for example, they wanted a checklist between the draft guide and also the mandated current apartment design guide. Where was the difference? How was our document different? They also wanted specific advice on criteria and measurements, and they also wanted a name change. The original document was going to be called a design guide, but they said, no, this is way much more than that. This is an advocacy and a planning document, so the title was changed. So there was quite significant changes to the document. And now I'm hoping if we can just play the video, which talks to what the guide is about.
The first 2,000 days of a child's life when they're 0 to 4 years of age is such a critical part of their health and well-being for the rest of their life. This guide is an aspirational guide, but it really sets the scene of practical ways to shape the environments to support their health and development over their life.
This guide is the first of its kind in Australia. We don't have a guide which is similar. I think that the effect of the guide will be significant, not just for the health and well-being of children and caregivers, but also to the future viability of high-density neighbourhoods generally.
The document is to guide decision makers to make better decisions and deliver better outcomes for families living in high density.
It's really wonderful to have this package together so that planners and developers and designers and councils can really understand what it is that families need in this setting and respond to those needs for now and for the families into the future that will continue to live in this setting.
I'm particularly impressed with the neighbourhood setting imperatives that are embedded in the guide.
This project has been a wonderful addition to the work for urban planning and design to help support healthy communities.
There's so much that can be done in local neighbourhoods, in public spaces and streets, social infrastructure, and all of that can happen for people already living in high density neighbourhoods.
And this will be a really good document that we can take to our councils and say this is something that you really need to take seriously and put into your planning instruments to create a healthy community.
Now the work begins to implement this guide, to talk to our partners and stakeholders to make this a reality. So let's go and implement this guide.
Thank you. So I've just got a couple more slides I'll just quickly run through because we launched it last September. It's been downloaded nearly 2,500 times. We've had nearly 9,000 views. Recently, it won the New South Wales Planning Institute Award for Community Wellbeing and Diversity, and we also, 2 weeks ago, won the Australian Urban Design Award for Research and Advocacy. That's an award, they're 2 industry awards that has led to incredible industry recognition and endorsement for the document. We have had several meetings from a policy context. We have, the City of Parramatta have started to amend their local environment plans. The Committee for Sydney recently hosted a workshop with 18 councils across Greater Sydney, using the guide as a reference document to see how they can make changes to their local environment plans. We've had several meetings with the government architect and other key government agencies. This industry leadership has been critical to the support, and we are really thankful that the exposure of these awards has opened many doors for us. In terms of design behaviours, we're partnering with University of Sydney Master of Design students who are using the guide for one of the Masters of designing the Tilapia redevelopment project. We're working with the government architect on this, where we provide feedback to the students. We've also been approached by other universities to look at embedding this guide into their course to sort of influence the design behaviours of architects and urban planners for the future. We continue to build the evidence to look at how we're measuring the impact of this guide to see change in the built environment and also neighbourhoods. Our goal is to continue to collaborate with a range of our partners to reform high-density housing policy, which will lead to better outcomes for families with children. There's been so many lessons that I've learnt, but just, I suppose, colour outside those lines. We are looking at housing from another perspective. We are powerful when we work more collaboratively. I know that you know this, but I think we did not envisage that we would win this national award. Next week, they're announcing the winners of the Planning Institute of Australia, the national awards, which we're a finalist for. And the reason I mention that is that it is a massive advocacy piece. We are agitating for change. We are a small-ish local health district that is getting the attention nationally with this piece of work, because the lives of children, just like Frankie here on the cover. Frankie's a 4-year-old girl. She lived in Western Sydney, but her family has now moved to regional New South Wales because they couldn't afford to live in the housing that Frankie is entitled to. And so I strongly urge you to download the guide when you can, to approach to wherever you live, to advocate for healthy high density living. It is achievable, and collaboration is key. And yeah, just keep colouring outside those lines. Thank you.
there any questions? Yes.
Hi, a really interesting piece of work, and I'm from Melbourne, so we're facing these same kinds of high-density corridor growth issues and things like that. In the research that you did, to what extent is a real sticking point not so much the architects but the developers themselves who hire architects that have particular boundaries put around them in terms of the design of apartments? You know, I've looked inside some of these apartments in terms of their child friendliness, and they're awful. They're bad enough for a couple in terms of their livability, let alone having a child or children in those spaces. So how do we get to that level?
So is your question, how do we sort of change the minds of developers? Yeah. Yeah. Look, developers are a really important stakeholder, but at the same time, and they certainly were engaged when we spoke to national forums such as the Urban Design Forum and Committee for Sydney. I think we didn't want this guide to be influenced by developers. I mean, this guide is built on health evidence, so it wasn't about, oh, well, you can do this because the developers are happy with 2.2 but not 2.4. So I think we are... Interestingly, Natalia Krysiak from Cities for Play, who is the architect who has co-authored this document, she has been approached by developers to seek her advice and to build more family-friendly apartments. It is context dependent. So when we had the council workshop recently, the Hills, I don't know if you're familiar, it's a fairly wealthy area in Western Sydney, and the GM spoke of the ease of more family-friendly apartments being built in the Hills because they're selling their big homes and they can afford to buy these 3-bedroom apartments. So I think we continue to look, we are advocating for change. We have got a lot of, and we will keep agitating for change that, I mean, yes, this is an aspirational document, but we're not hiding. We would love this to be policy. These recommendations similar recommendations were made several years ago and weren't implemented. But there does seem to be a shift because people want to live near cities. People want to live near hospitals and schools and services, and that means we need to go up. And we can go up, and density can be done well if it is planned. And so the good thing is with this award, the government architect tells me it's just seeing the issue from a different perspective, and we do the public health perspective does add a different lens. So I think the more we do have government agencies from planning, transport, health collectively, and obviously we need to engage stakeholders, but I'm presenting the health evidence, and that's so. I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but there are some changes. And whilst this is aspirational, the dream is that for it to be policy, and if it's policy, then we will see more family-friendly apartments. Yeah. 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 I know. Yeah, and that's right. I mean, strata. You're not allowed to play here. Or when we're at the Urban Design Awards 2 weeks ago, Jeremy McLeod, who's from Melbourne, he from Breathe Architecture, he won an accolade, and his design is amazing. Like, we need more of Jeremy McLeod's, and I mean that is one of the reasons why we are working with architects and designers of the future to embed it now. That it is that the needs of families with children are considered, you know, at the very beginning, at the planning stage. Yeah.
This question's more around the sort of areas, not specifically the actual buildings themselves, but a lot of the play spaces that are disappearing around where I live, for instance, the school, everyone used to walk their dogs and play on the school oval, they used to play on the school tennis courts, but then the school built a fence because they found a few needles on the oval, they had some vandalism issues. So now that entire play space is gone. The high density increase has been so significant that the sports ovals are now talking about trying to peel back some of the sport play space to make way for car parking spaces. The tennis courts are being replaced with buildings, and so some of the community spaces are disappearing at quite an alarming rate, actually. And I know that's because our area doesn't have a plan, but because I love in particular about some of your designs the way that you are embedding play in the walking paths, so that actual travel paths between the different spaces that they're going to use. How does the negotiation happen between those different... Because the school's owned by the Department of Education, I guess, and the council owns the sports ovals, and is there any way to connect them all? Or is that too aspirational?
Yeah, I mean, look, to be honest, because I'm not a planner, I'm not totally sure of the answer to that. I do know, green space is crucial for so many reasons, and maintaining that. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can answer that question. Sorry.
You did so much formative research, so I was just interested, obviously in Europe, for example, you have a lot of high-density housing, so have you looked at best practices from there, and have those kind of made it into the guide as well? Maybe you mentioned it, I didn't hear it.
Yeah, no, they did, and I suppose that's one of the sad realities, that we didn't have enough local case studies to include in the guide, and that sort of next phase is wanting to include local case studies. But when Natalia, on her Churchill Fellowship, Denmark, several countries that she went to. So in the guide, you'll see that there are several European examples. But what we're doing now in our council workshop is to ask them to share family, best practice examples, because we want this guide to be full of Australian examples and not those from overseas. But the reality is we don't have enough. And
I would like to ask you, how would inflation, looking at the rising cost going high inflation, how this will affect living standards in Australia, or have this been covered with your research, or have you thought about that? Because that's really very critical to look at this angle, that household incomes have gone down, there are job cuts, there are other factors happening, and so how could that impact to this plan?
Yeah, if we're talking about accessible and affordable housing here, so one of our key stakeholders is Homes New South Wales, and so we are speaking with community housing organisations. We spoke to them 2 weeks ago. Also speaking to the government developer Landcom, because ideally we want the government to be, in terms of affordable social housing, is to lead by example there. So part of our next phase of this project is working really closely with exactly supporting the communities that you mentioned, and certainly in Parramatta, many of the families are renting. We're not even talking about people that can afford to buy this apartment. So it's real, and so we're also working with the council to embed the plan in some of their community housing strategies as well. So it's this sort of advocacy at a state level, but also certainly with the local councils to look at exactly that. Because from a public health perspective, we are concerned with supporting people in greatest need, and this is where this project derived from, and it's really ensuring that those families that don't have a voice, that can't complain and say, why can't my child, they just feel thankful that they've got somewhere to live. But we specifically are working with Homes New South Wales and other community housing organisations to look at how we can embed the guide in those environments.
Round of applause for Belinda. Thank you very much. So that concludes this session, and I'm sure you're all dying for lunch, so I'm going to bring it to a close. Thank you very much for your attendance. It was lovely to engage in the question and answer session.